The Void Seeker fleet was a ghost armada before it ever reached the shores of the Ghoul Stars. 300 vessels, a conclave of might and heresy, led by the Archmagos, dreadnought, the logic inviolate, translated from the immaterium with a precision that bordered on the profane. There was no chaotic spray of displaced energies, no lingering taint of the Empyrean. One moment, the void at the edge of the Segmentum Ultima was empty. The next, it was filled with the silent, brooding congregation of steel and ambition. They hung in the starlight like a congregation of iron prophets, their weapons cold, their augur arrays drinking in the profound emptiness before them. This was the fringe of the galaxy, the last gasp of stellar creation before the unending intergalactic void. Their destination lay ahead, a region of space colored not by nebula or starfire, but by a chilling, pervasive absence on all charts of the known galaxy. At the heart of this fleet, within the nospheric core of the logic inviolate, Archmagos Valerius Kane observed the frontier. He was less a man than a monument to surgical artistry and intellectual arrogance. His original human form was a distant memory, a footnote in the sprawling codex of his own existence. Now, he was a towering construction of brass, steel, and shimmering data looms. His face was a polished silver death mask, its features impassive, with a dozen optical lenses of varying sizes glowing with cold blue light. He stood bolted to a command throne that was itself an extension of the ship, his consciousness not merely networked with the vessel, but interwoven with its very machine spirit. Data, pure and unfiltered, flowed through him, telemetry from the fleet, stellar cartography, and the faint, almost imperceptible whispers that were the reason for this great and terrible exodus. For 2 centuries, Kane had pursued the whispers. He called it the anamnesis of the void, but his acolytes had a simpler, more potent name, scrap code. It was the psychic detritus of civilizations long extinct, the final fading data screams of races that had burned to death under alien suns or been consumed by horrors from beyond time. While the Imperium saw only the warp as the conduit for psychic energy, Kane saw it as a contaminated, chaotic sewer. The true ocean, he theorized, was reality itself, saturated with the faint, residual thoughts of every living thing that had ever existed. This scrap code, he believed, held the key to everything, a true understanding of the universe's history, the secrets of forgotten technologies, and, most importantly, a new form of faster-than-light travel. The silent path, a way to cross the stars without begging passage from the demons of the warp or relying on the flawed genetics of navigators. It was a heresy of the highest order, a direct challenge to the foundations upon which the Imperium's interstellar travel was built. It was a dream of pure, untainted progress, and for that dream, Kane had willingly become a renegade, taking with him a fleet of disciples, Scitarii legions, and indentured naval crews, who either shared his vision or were given no choice. A chime, soft as a falling tear, echoed in his private nospheric channel. It was the designated signal of Magos Dominus Thule, his second in command, and the most persistent splinter of doubt in Kane's grand design. Archmagos, Thule's synthesized voice crackled, laced with the electronic static of a vox emitter struggling against an unseen interference. The mortal crews are growing restless. Morale metrics have fallen below sanctioned parameters on 17 vessels. Reports from the ship confessors speak of disquiet. Kane allowed a microsecond of his processing power to access the relevant reports. Disquiet. The word was an insult to the data. It was not disquiet. It was a slow, creeping rot of the soul. On the lower decks of the fleet's Imperial Navy cruisers, men and women complained of hearing voices in the metallic hum of the ventilation systems. They saw fleeting shapes in their peripheral vision, figures that vanished when faced directly. Astropaths screamed in their sanctums, not of the warp's fury, but of a crushing, static-filled silence that felt heavier and more malevolent than any demonic presence. The scrap code was not inert. It was seeping into the minds of the fleet's weakest links, the flesh and blood humans whose minds were not shielded by the pure logic of the machine god. The weak will be culled by the rigors of the journey, Magos Dominus. Kane's own voice was a deep, resonant bass, devoid of any inflection. Their fears are the data ghosts of lesser species. Insignificant. Ensure the commissariat detachments are diligent. The mission parameters have not changed. With respect, Archmagos, Thule pressed, his persistence a flaw Kane had long tolerated for his subordinate's brilliance in plasma drive mechanics. This is more than simple fear. The Geller field generators are fluctuating, even in real space. The machine spirits are sullen. They report phantom energy signatures that our augurs cannot verify. It is as if the very fabric of this region resents our presence. We are on the precipice of a graveyard that spans 1,000 light years. A graveyard is a library for those with the wit to read the tombstones. Kane countered, his optical lenses focusing on a swirling vortex of dark energy light years ahead, the Veil of Sighs, the gateway. For 10,000 years, the Adeptus Mechanicus has stagnated, poring over the same corroded STCs and fearing innovation as the highest form of blasphemy. They fear the unknown. I intend to catalog it, dissect it, and bend it to the will of mankind. The Emperor's work was left unfinished. He bound us to the malevolence of the warp. I will unbind us. The sheer monumental heresy of the statement hung in the noosphere between them. To claim the Emperor's great work was flawed was a death sentence 1,000 times over. But here, at the edge of the galaxy, the dictates of Terra were a distant echo. There was only the mission. On the bridge of the Dictatus Maximus, a lunar-class cruiser crewed by bondsmen from a dozen chastised worlds, Captain Gregor Vorn stared at the star chart. The Ghoul Stars were not stars at all. They were holes in the sky, patches of absolute blackness where the light of distant galaxies seemed to bend and die. His ship felt cold, a deep, penetrating chill that no amount of heat from the plasma reactor could dispel. For a week, his master-at-arms had been reporting a surge in violence among the ratings. Men were fighting over imagined slights, hoarding rations, and carving strange, spiraling symbols onto the bulkheads. 2 nights ago, a petty officer had walked calmly to an observation blister, smashed the armored glass with a wrench, and allowed the void to take him, his face a mask of serene terror. Vorn had flogged the witnesses for speaking of it, but he could not flog the memory from his own mind. The officer's final whispered words had been about the choir in the static. He was a naval man, a veteran of the Damocles Gulf Crusade. He understood war against the Tau, the Orc, the Heretic. It was a matter of tonnage, trajectories, and volley fire. This was different. The enemy was not a fleet on his auger screen. It was in the air he breathed, in the low thrum of his ship's deck plates. It was an enemy of the mind, and he had no weapons to fight it. His faith in the God Emperor felt thin here, a threadbare cloak against a cosmic blizzard. He served the Omnissiah's priests now, and their God was a cold and calculating thing that offered no comfort against the terrors of the dark. His gaze fell upon the hulking shape of the Logic Inviolate, a titan of a ship that dwarfed his own. It was a temple to Kane's ambition, and Vorn felt a sickening certainty that they were all to be sacrificed upon its altar. Back in his sanctum, Archmagos Kane dismissed Thule from his thoughts. The concerns of lesser minds were a distraction. He extended a mechadendrite, its tip a gleaming silver needle, and interfaced with a pulsating crystal suspended in an anti-gravitic field at the center of the chamber. This was the echo locus, the primary receptor for the scrap code. Through it, Kane could begin to sift the whispers. He heard them not as words, but as pure, raw data streams of emotion and concept. He felt the silicon-based terror of a crystalline race as their sun went nova. He experienced the sorrow of a gas giant dwelling species as their world was devoured by a Terranid splinter fleet. He tasted the cold, logical satisfaction of a machine intelligence as it purged its own final, lingering biological components. It was a symphony of extinction, a chorus of a billion dead souls. And within it, buried deep, were the patterns, the echoes of psychic races who had bent reality, not with the crude, chaotic energies of the warp, but with precise resonant frequencies. That was the key. The silent path was not a technology to be built, but a song to be learned. All vessels, Yepes Fowls, his voice boomed across the fleet-wide Vox, a command that overrode all other transmissions. Set course for the Veil of Sighs, standard formation, trust in logic, trust in the machine. All else is illusion. He disconnected from the echo locus, the ghost sensations of a dozen dead races fading from his consciousness. His blue lenses glowed with an intensity that bordered on religious fervor. The cost was irrelevant. The madness of the cruise, the sullenness of the machine spirits, the warnings of his subordinates, it was all just noise. He was Valerius Kane, and he would drag humanity into a new age, even if he had to carve a path to enlightenment through the souls of every man and woman in his fleet. The graveyard awaited, and with it, salvation. The Veil of Sighs was not a nebula of dust and gas, but a wound in the fabric of reality. On the fleet's long-range augurs, it appeared as a vast, swirling curtain of gravitational and energetic anomalies, a cosmic shroud dozens of light years thick. Visually, it was more unsettling. It absorbed the light of the galaxies beyond, creating a tapestry of absolute blackness that was somehow deeper and more final than the simple void between stars. As the Void Seeker fleet drew closer, the mortal crews lining the observation decks swore they could see movement within it, slow, majestic, and sorrowful, like the turning of a leviathan in a fathomless ocean. The whispers in the bulkheads intensified, coalescing from random noise into something that resembled a choir of mourners singing a dirge in a language of pure static. Archmagos Kane observed the veil from his command throne, his consciousness a nexus of 1,000 data streams. To him, the phenomenon was beautiful. It was a physical manifestation of his theories, a concentration of scrap code so dense it warped the laws of physics. A tsunami of phantom information, he subvocalized to his inner circle of magi, the collective death rattle of a galactic quadrant. We are about to sail into the memory of a dead god. Magos Dominus Thule, his form a spider-like construct of whirring gyros and hydraulic limbs, broadcast a wave of pure descent. Archmagos, the fleet's machine spirits are in recoil. They sense an anti-logic, a corruption of the holy sequence. The Omnissiah's grace does not extend into such a place. I implore you, we must recalibrate the echolocus, find a weaker point of entry. Weakness is for the flesh, Magos. Kane's reply was cold iron. We will not skirt the edges of this revelation. We will pierce its heart. The data is most pure at its source. All vessels maintain approach vectors. Engage primary void shields. Recalibrate Geller field emitters to project a reality anchor pattern, frequency Epsilon 9. The field will not protect us from the warp here, but it will reinforce the integrity of our physical space against the psychic pressure. It was a command born of supreme arrogance, applying a technology meant for one impossible reality to combat another, entirely unknown one. The moment the prow of the logic inviolate breached the outer wisps of the veil, the fleet-wide vox, which had been filled with the low hum of readiness, erupted into a pandemonium of screams. It was not a sound of pain, but of pure, undiluted terror. For every soul in the fleet, it felt as though 1 billion other consciousnesses were suddenly trying to inhabit their mind. They were flooded with the final moments of forgotten races, the agony of burning cities, the despair of watching a son die, the cold terror of being the last of one's kind. The scrap code was no longer a whisper. It was a deafening, soul-shattering roar. On the bridge of the Dictatus Maximus, Captain Vorn was thrown against a command console as the ship violently shuddered. Red alert klaxons blared, their sound distorted into a grotesque, wailing shriek. The lights flickered and died, plunging the bridge into the hellish emergency lighting that painted everything in shades of blood. "Report!" he bellowed, his voice hoarse. His Vox officer was slumped over his station, clawing at his helmet as a trickle of blood ran from his ear. The Master of Ordnance was staring at his tactical display, his face a mask of disbelief as the schematic of an enemy vessel flickered over his screen, a ship of impossible crystalline geometry that did not exist. "Phantom contact, shields failing, port side lance batteries are powering up without command." Across the fleet, the same chaos bloomed. On Kane's tactical hololith, 2/3 of the 300 vessels flared with crimson warning runes. The scrap code was acting like a viral signal, infiltrating every system not hardened by Kane's personal, esoteric wards. Void shields, designed to repel torpedoes and laser fire, offered no resistance to a tidal wave of dead thoughts. They flickered and collapsed as their emitter servitors were driven into recursive logic loops, endlessly trying to calculate the threat profile of a feeling of loss. Geller field generators, repurposed as reality anchors, began to overload. Tech priests chanted frantic litanies of repair, beating their fists against housings that glowed cherry red. On the strike cruiser Iron Resolve, the field collapsed entirely. For a horrifying 10 seconds, the reality of the Ghoul Stars bled onto its decks. Bulkheads sagged and wept a viscous black fluid. Crewmen fused with the deck plating, their faces frozen in silent screams. Then, with a soundless implosion of warped light, the vessel and its 4,000 crew simply ceased to be, leaving behind nothing but a lingering psychic echo of their terror. The insanity gripping the mortal crews became a physical plague. On the lower decks, entire regiments of indentured soldiery turned on each other, their eyes vacant, screaming the death cries of alien species. They fought with bayonets, wrenches, and bare hands, their violence not born of anger, but of a desperate need to silence the noise in their heads. Servitors, their minds a blend of degraded organic matter and simple logic engines, were uniquely vulnerable. Maintenance servitors began methodically deconstructing vital ship systems, their optical sensors glowing with the reflected light of imaginary stars. Gun servitors swiveled on their mounts, tracking phantom targets within their own ships, their targeting reticules locking onto the panicked faces of their human masters. Even within the sanctums of the Mechanicus, the onslaught was felt. Skitarii maniples stood frozen on the decks, their data tethers flooding their minds with sensory inputs from dying worlds, causing their binaric cant to stutter into streams of meaningless code. Only the most hardened, the most, rigorously programmed, like Marshal Vex and his personal cohorts, could maintain discipline, their minds clinging to the pure logic of their doctrina, imperatives as a drowning man clings to a rock in a storm. From his throne, Valerius Kane watched the unfolding catastrophe with the detached air of a scientist observing a chaotic but fascinating chemical reaction. The loss of the iron resolve was a flicker of red on his display, noted and dismissed. The screams of the dying were filtered out by his audio dampeners. He was focused solely on the data pouring into the echolocus. It was glorious. The raw, untamed power of the veil was beyond his most optimistic projections. Magos Thule, he broadcasted, his voice an island of calm in the ocean of madness. Divert auxiliary plasma flow from the weapon systems to the Geller emitters. Overload them if you must. We require a stable reality pocket for another 17 minutes to clear the densest strata of the field. Overload them. Thule's reply was incredulous, transmitted over a private channel thick with the crackle of energy discharge. Archmagos, that risks a cascade reactor breach. The machine spirits are already in agony. This is blasphemy. Your sentiment is noted, Magos, Kane responded, a new mechadendrite extending from his back to interface with the ship's core navigation. And your compliance is expected. We are not here to pray to the machine. We are here to command it. Execute my orders. With a silent curse of binary code, Thule obeyed. Across the surviving ships, energy was siphoned from weapons and secondary systems, pouring into the groaning reality anchors. The field stabilized, but at a terrible cost. Shields remained down. Weapons were cold. The fleet was now a convoy of deaf and toothless ironclads, sailing through hell on the strength of their leader's conviction alone. They pushed on through the suffocating darkness, a fleet of madhouses and ghost ships. 12 more frigates and destroyers went dark, their lights extinguishing one by one as their life support failed or their crews tore their own ships apart. They did not explode. They simply became silent tombs, destined to drift in this cosmic graveyard for all eternity. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The last tendrils of the veil of size slid past their sterns. The fleet emerged into a new region of space. The screaming in their minds subsided into a constant, low-level hum of sorrow. The warning runes on the tactical displays faded. Before them lay the Ghoul Stars proper. A scattering of dead white dwarf stars cast a pale, sepulchral light over dozens of dark worlds. The void here was not empty. It felt crowded, watched. They had survived their passage, but the fleet that emerged was not the same one that had entered. They were scarred, diminished, and deeply, irrevocably haunted. Every surviving crewman, from the lowest rating to the highest captain, now carried an echo of the veil within them. They had crossed the threshold, paid the toll in ships and souls, and now floated in the heart of a galaxy-sized tomb. The silence that descended was more terrifying than the screams had ever been. In the funereal twilight of the Ghoul Stars, the Void-Seeker fleet drifted. The silence that followed the passage through the veil of sighs was a heavy shroud, punctuated only by the ceaseless, frantic canticles of repair being broadcast from ship to ship. Damage reports scrolled across the logic inviolate's primary hololith, a litany of ruin. 43 vessels were declared lost, their names turning from a healthy Mechanicus green to a stark final crimson. A further 87 were severely damaged, their reactors unstable, their hulls breached, their crews decimated by madness and a reality they were never meant to witness. The fleet, once a proud armada of 300, was now a battered convoy of survivors, limping through a cosmic ossuary under the gaze of dead suns. Archmagos Kane allowed the reports to accumulate, his analytical mind processing the losses with the emotional detachment of a factorum drone cataloging rivets. The cost was acceptable. The data gained was invaluable. He had navigated the storm, and now he would chart the dead sea that lay beyond. He broadcast a single fleet-wide summons, a burst of code that demanded the attention of every surviving shipmaster in Magos. On bridges and in command sanctums, hololithic projectors sputtered to life, casting a towering, blue-tinged effigy of Kane amidst the wreckage and chaos of their own vessels. Captain Vorn of the Dictatus Maximus stood stiffly at attention as the Archmagos' image shimmered into existence. His bridge was a shambles. 2 of his bridge crew were dead. Another had been dragged away screaming by the ship's commissar, and a faint, acrid smell of ozone and burnt circuitry hung in the air. The sight of the impassive, silver-masked demigod did little to soothe his frayed nerves. He, like every other commander, was awaiting orders to consolidate, to find a safe harbor to begin the decades of repair that would be needed. He expected a course to be set for the nearest defensible star system. "Commanders of the Void Seekers," Kane's voice echoed from the projectors, a sound of perfect, unfeeling synthesis. "You have endured the crucible and have been found adequate. The preliminary test is concluded. Now the true voyage begins." A collective wave of disbelief and dread rippled through the noospheric command channels. Test? This was the test? Traditional astrogation is now obsolete, Kane continued as a new chart bloomed around his effigy. It was not a map of stars and planets, but a swirling, chaotic web of faint, luminous lines like a river system drawn in light. The lines flowed and pulsed, converging in some areas, thinning to nothing in others. The space between these dead stars is not empty. It is filled with the psychic residue of fallen empires, currents of memory and emotion. These are the ghost currents. They are our new roads. Our augurs and star charts are blind here. From this moment forward, our course will be determined solely by the readings of the echolocus. Magos Dominus Thuli's arachnid form scuttled forward on the bridge of his own vessel, the Omnissiah's anvil, his hololithic representation manifesting beside Kane's. "Archmagos, this is madness." His synthesized voice was sharp with alarm, a discordant shriek of logic violation. "You propose to navigate this fleet using the death screams of Xenos races? This is not navigation. It is technosorcery. The currents you speak of are not governed by the laws of physics or the pure sequence of the Omnissiah. They are tides of grief and hatred. To follow them is to invite damnation and corruption upon us all." "Your distinction between technology and sorcery is a failure of imagination, Magos," Kane replied, his tone unchanging. "The Omnissiah is the god of all knowledge, not merely the knowledge you find comfortable. The echolocus does not interpret, it measures. It charts the path of least psychic resistance and greatest informational density. We will sail these rivers of data to their source. There, we will find the nexus of power required for the silent path." His effigy turned its head, the dozen lenses of its mask seeming to stare directly at Captain Vorn and the other naval commanders. "Your shipmasters will receive course corrections in non-Euclidean vectors. Your engine seers will translate them. You will follow my commands without deviation. The currents are narrow. To stray from them is to become becalmed in a sea of utter oblivion, or to be dashed against shoals of concentrated insanity." The command was absolute. There was no room for debate. The hololiths vanished, leaving the commanders in the dim light of their ruined bridges, facing a truth more terrifying than any enemy fleet. They were not explorers in an unknown region of space. They were ghost sailors on a river of the dead, captained by a madman. The first maneuver was a trial of faith and terror. A stream of impossible calculations flowed from the logic inviolate, coordinates that twisted back on themselves, velocity vectors that seemed to demand the ship be in 2 places at once. On the Dictatus Maximus, Vorn watched his engine seers, their faces pale beneath their rebreather masks, as they worked feverishly to translate Kane's commands into instructions the ship's machine spirit could comprehend. The hulking vessel groaned, its structure complaining as it performed a slow, graceful turn that bore no relation to the thrust its engines were applying. It was as if the ship was being caught by an invisible tide, its own propulsion serving only to keep its prow aligned with the unseen flow. Slowly, ponderously, the entire surviving fleet fell into a single, elongated formation, following the immense wake of the Logic Inviolate as it carved a path down a shimmering, invisible current. The journey was eerily silent. They passed worlds that had been scoured to the bedrock by forgotten weapons, their surfaces smooth and glassy. They navigated through vast fields of crystalline debris that chimed against their void shields, the remnants of fleets that had fought and died eons before the first human ever left Terra. They saw dead suns, not white dwarfs, but colossal spheres of black diamond, their light and heat forever extinguished, their immense gravity a constant lurking danger. The psychological toll was immense. The crews, already traumatized, were now subjected to a constant, low-level psychic broadcast. As they followed a particularly strong current, every soul on every ship would experience the same fleeting sensation: the taste of spiced alien air, the feeling of multiple limbs, the sight of a city of towering organic spires under a violet sky. These were the memories of the race that had left this psychic wake, bleeding through into the minds of the fleet. One current carried with it a profound sense of loss that brought hardened naval armsmen to their knees, weeping for a home they had never known. Another was tinged with a cold, intellectual fury, causing tech priests to fly into rages, smashing consoles that did not perform with perfect efficiency. Captain Vorn found himself standing on his bridge for 20-hour shifts, unable to rest. Sleep brought nightmares woven from the memories of the dead. He saw the crystalline warships from his Master of Ordnance's phantom reading, soaring through a nebula of silver and gold. He felt the terror of their crews as a greater darkness, a thing of chitin and endless hunger, descended upon them. He began to understand. They were not just following echoes. They were sailing down the scar tissue of a genocide that had occurred millions of years ago. The ghost current was the psychic trail of a retreating, dying race. Days turned into weeks. The fleet grew adept at the ghostly navigation, the ships learning to tack and veer with the subtle shifts in the current. Yet the peril was ever present. The destroyer Vigilance miscalculated a maneuver, its stern drifting just a few thousand kilometers outside the main current. It was not destroyed by an impact or a weapon. It simply stopped. Its lights went out. All Vox contact was lost. Auger scans showed it was still there, a dark shape in the void, but it was utterly inert, as if every machine spirit and living soul aboard had been instantly and completely erased. It was now just another piece of debris in the graveyard, a warning to the others. Finally, after a journey that felt like an eternity, the voice of Kane echoed through the fleet once more. "We have arrived." In front of them, the ghost current they had been following merged with a dozen others, creating a swirling maelstrom of psychic energy centered on a single unremarkable solar system. The echolocus indicates a convergence point of unprecedented magnitude, a wellspring. We have found one of the libraries of the dead. His gaze, and in that of the entire fleet, was drawn to the system's third planet. It glittered in the pale starlight, a world made not of rock and soil, but of pure, multifaceted crystal. The world they called Xylos hung in the void like a fractured diamond, catching the ghostly light of its dead sun and refracting it into a billion spectral shards. It was a planet of impossible beauty and profound silence. Entire continents were formed from colossal, interlocking crystalline structures that soared miles into the thin, frozen atmosphere. Mountains were jagged peaks of translucent quartz, plains were vast, flat expanses of polished obsidian, and oceans were slow-moving seas of liquid silicon, their shores lined with beaches of glittering, granulated gemstone. There was no sign of life, no heat, no movement, save for the slow, majestic rotation of the planet itself. Yet, to the augurs of the fleet, and especially to the supersentient senses of Archmagos Kane, Xylos was screaming. It was the source, the epicenter of the psychic maelstrom they had navigated. The crystal that formed the very bedrock of the world was a recording medium of unimaginable capacity, and it held the memories of an entire civilization at the moment of its agonizing extinction. "Behold," Kane's voice, transmitted across a secure notospheric channel to his inner circle, was imbued with a rare and chilling reverence. the chronocrypts of the Signari, a race of psionically resonant silicon-based life forms. They did not build with stone or steel, they sang their world into existence, shaping it with pure thought. And when they died, their thoughts, their memories, their very consciousnesses were imprinted into the lattice of the world itself. This is not a tomb, it is a library of souls. On the command deck of the Scutaria macroclade transport, Legio Metallica, Marshal Vex received his deployment orders. Vex was a creature of singular purpose. Over 98% of his body was augmetic, his consciousness a cold, clean stream of tactical data and doctrina imperatives. Emotion, fear, and doubt were alien concepts he observed in biologicals with a remote, analytical curiosity. His face was a brass plate, etched with the skull of the Adeptus Mechanicus, his only organic components a sliver of brainstem and a spinal column encased in a nutrient-rich suspension gel deep within his adamantium torso. He was the pinnacle of what the Mechanicus believed a soldier should be, a holy weapon guided by perfect logic. The orders from the Archmagos were precise. Vex was to lead a full planetary deployment. 5,000 maniples of Scutarii, supported by a dozen cohorts of Cataphren battle servitors, and 3 full lances of Onager Duncrawlers, were to establish a fortified perimeter around the largest crystalline spire, designated Primary Locus Alpha. Following this, legions of tech excavators and servitor miners would descend to begin the delicate and dangerous process of harvesting the data crystal. They were not to shatter it, but to carefully slice and extract vast, geometrically perfect segments containing the most potent scrap code signatures. The operation was to be named the Great Tithe. The descent was an unnerving spectacle. Thousands of landers and orbital transports broke from the fleet, their metallic hides a stark contrast to the shimmering world below. They entered the atmosphere not with the roar of burning promethium, but in an eerie silence, the thin air offering little resistance. They touched down on a great obsidian plain at the foot of a crystalline spire that pierced the heavens, a single flawless structure of amber-colored crystal that seemed to hum with a silent internal energy. The moment the Scutari legions marched forth, their disciplined, metallic tread echoing across the silent plains, the planet began to react. At first it was subtle. The air grew colder, a low, resonant hum, below the range of human hearing but felt deep in the bones, emanated from the crystal beneath their feet. The Scutarii, their minds shielded by layers of code and dogma, felt it only as a flicker of ghost data in their sensoriums. But for the less augmented tech priests supervising the deployment of the mining equipment, it was a far more disturbing sensation. They felt a sense of being watched, of trespassing in a sacred place. They heard whispers carried on the non-existent wind, words spoken in a language of pure mathematics and resonant frequencies. Marshal Vex stood on the command pulpit of a Triaros armored conveyor, observing the deployment with his multispectral optics. "Maintain perimeter discipline," he broadcast in crisp, staccato binaric cant. "Ignore phantom data streams. The environment is psychically reactive. Trust in the logic of the blessed machine." His very presence was a calming influence, an anchor of pure, unyielding order in a place that was beginning to fray at the edges of sanity. The first of the great sonic excavators was brought to bear on the base of the spire. These were monstrous machines, their primary tool not a drill or a laser, but a series of massive harmonic resonators that could be tuned to vibrate at a frequency that would cause the crystal to cleave along its natural lattice lines. Magos Artifex Bor, a corpulent priest whose lower body had been replaced by a tracked industrial unit, personally oversaw the first cut. Chanting litanies of severance, he activated the machine. A deafening low-frequency hum filled the air, and the ground trembled. A line of pure white light appeared on the surface of the amber spire, and a vast 1,000-ton slab of perfect crystal began to slowly separate from the main structure. The moment the slab was severed, Xylos screamed. It was not a sound, but a wave of pure psychic force that slammed into the Mechanicus host. For the first time, even the Scutarii felt it. A wave of indescribable grief, the collective sorrow of 1,000,000,000,000 souls dying at once, washed over them. Their doctrina imperatives faltered. Scutarii rangers fell to their knees, their enhanced optics replaying scenes that were not their own. Crystalline cities shattering, families of light being extinguished, a sky filled with a swarm of an unnameable devouring foe. The tech priests clutched their heads, their cogitator minds overwhelmed by a flood of alien emotion that was a poison to their logic-driven thoughts. Marshal Vex remained standing. The wave of grief hit him like a physical blow, registering in his systems as a critical error, a data deluge of illogical sentiment. For a nanosecond, his core programming threatened to crash. He saw an image flash in his mind, a tall, slender being of pure golden light, holding the hand of a smaller one as their world ended around them. The feeling of loss was absolute, a mathematical certainty of utter finality. Then, his programming reasserted itself. He ran a diagnostic, identified the data stream as hostile, and purged it. The process took 1.3 seconds. Hostile psychic phenomenon detected. His voice cut through the mental chaos, a clarion call of cold reason. All maniples, activate Protector Doctrina, purge emotional feedback, recalibrate to combat parameters. The integrity of the mission is absolute. His words, backed by the sheer, indomitable force of his will, were a firewall of logic. The Scutarii rose to their feet, their systems rebooting, the alien grief purged and replaced by the cold, clean imperatives of war. They raised their galvanic rifles, their rad carbines, and their transuranic arquebuses, their target finders scanning the shimmering landscape for a foe they could not yet see. The great slab of harvested crystal, now fully detached, began to pulse with a soft internal light. From its multifaceted surface, shimmering, vaguely humanoid shapes began to emerge. They were not solid, but formed of pure, coherent light and swirling psychic energy. They were the Signari, or rather, the echoes of their dead warriors, the psychic guardians of the chronocrypts, awakened by the desecration of their world tomb. They carried lances of hard light and shields that shimmered with temporal distortion. They made no sound, but their intent was clear, a focused wave of righteous fury that was a stark contrast to the earlier wave of grief. The great tithe had begun, and the dead had risen to deny it. The plains of Zelos, once silent for millennia, erupted into a phantasmal war. The ghostly defenders of the Signari did not march. They flowed across the crystalline ground like a river of vengeful light. Where they passed, the very air seemed to crackle with temporal anomalies. A Scutari ranger would take aim at one of the shimmering figures, only for his galvanic rifle to suddenly rust into dust in his hands, aged 10,000 years in a single second. An Onager Dunecrawler would fire its neutron laser, but the beam would slow to a crawl, taking agonizing minutes to cross the battlefield, allowing the spectral warriors to simply step aside. They were fighting not just an enemy, but the memory of an enemy, one that fought with weapons that bent the laws of physics and time. Panic, a corrosive and illogical emotion, began to seep into the Scutarii ranks. Their weapons, calibrated for the brutal realities of material warfare, were proving disturbingly ineffective. Rad rounds passed through the light forms with no discernible effect. Heavy stubber bullets ricocheted from shields of solidified grief. The only weapon that seemed to have any purchase was the plasma culliver, its superheated energies causing the spectral forms to momentarily destabilize and flicker, but they would coalesce again moments later. The psychic assault was relentless. Every volley from the Signari echoes was accompanied by a wave of pure emotion, despair that caused triggers to feel impossibly heavy, fear that made targeting augurs display monstrous illusions, and a profound sorrow that made the act of war feel like a pointless, soul-crushing blasphemy. At the heart of the maelstrom, Marshal Vex was an anchor of cold, unwavering logic. His command pulpit had become a fortress, surrounded by his personal cohort of Sicarian rust stalkers and infiltrators, their transonic blades humming with murderous intent. He ignored the emotional and temporal chaos, his mind a fortress of pure data. He was not fighting ghosts. He was solving a tactical problem. His multispectral optics analyzed the enemy, stripping away their ethereal appearance and reducing them to raw data. He noted their energy signatures, their fluctuation patterns, the temporal decay rates of their attacks. He saw not warriors, but weaponized information. All maniples. His binaric can't cut through the psychic static, a signal of pure, unadulterated command. Cease fire with solid-state projectiles. Ineffective. Reroute energy from motive systems to galvanic and radium weapon capacitors. Overcharge them. We will not target their forms. We will saturate their positions with disruptive energy. Data scourge protocols are now in effect. His orders were counterintuitive. He was telling his soldiers to effectively blind fire, to create killing fields of pure energy rather than targeting individual enemies. To the lesser tech priests, it seemed a waste of precious resources. To the Scutari, it was a blessed command from their marshal, a new equation for victory. The legions obeyed instantly. The rhythmic crackle of galvanic rifles was replaced by a sustained, deafening roar as thousands of weapons were deliberately overloaded. Vast arcs of blue-white energy erupted from the Scutarii firing lines, creating a crackling, impassable wall of raw power. Radium carbines blanketed entire swaths of the battlefield in lethal invisible radiation, their effect on the ethereal Signari uncertain but creating zones of absolute denial. The effect on the ghost warriors was immediate. Caught in the storm of uncontrolled energy, their forms flickered violently. They were constructs of pure, ordered psychic energy, and the chaotic, raw power of the Mechanicus weapons was like a static blast to their delicate cohesion. They began to fray at the edges, their brilliant light dimming, their forms becoming distorted and monstrous. For the first time, the advance of the silent host faltered. Vex observed the result for precisely 4.7 seconds. Analysis. Enemy cohesion is vulnerable to broad-spectrum energy saturation. Conclusion. Escalate saturation. His next series of commands was directed at the towering war machines at the rear. Onager lances retask eradication beamers, abandon focused targeting, initiate sweeping fire pattern Delta 7, Cataphren breacher cohorts advance, create a breach in the enemy line with your heavy arc rifles, we will dissect their formation. The monstrous Onager dune crawlers, their insectile forms bristling with arcane weaponry, swiveled their primary armaments. The focused pinpoint beams of their eradication beamers were replaced by wide, sweeping cones of incandescent energy that scythed across the battlefield, vaporizing the very ground and erasing dozens of the light forms in each pass. Into the gaps created by this onslaught marched the Cataphren breachers. These were monstrous amalgams of man and machine, their torsos grafted onto tracked motive units, their minds little more than firing processors. They advanced in a solid wall of steel and flesh, their heavy arc rifles firing in perfect unison, unleashing crackling bolts of chained energy that leaped from one spectral warrior to the next, causing them to explode in silent bursts of fading light. Under the relentless, brutal logic of Vex's command, the tide of the battle began to turn. The ethereal grace of the Signari was being crushed by the sheer, overwhelming force of Mechanicus firepower applied with cold mathematical precision. Vex had become the living embodiment of the Protector Doctrina, his tactical genius a shield for the entire army. The Scutarii, their faith in their martial absolute, fought with renewed mechanical ferocity. They purged the alien emotions from their minds, replacing them with the clean, simple joy of executing a perfect firing solution. They became, as Vex intended, extensions of their weapons, cogs in a flawless war machine. A legend was being forged on that crystalline plane, not of a heroic charge or a noble sacrifice, but of a cold and perfect application of logic against a foe that defied all reason. The mortal crews and lesser tech priests watching the battle unfold on tactical displays from the orbiting fleet saw only the relentless advance of the Mechanicus forces. They saw the ghostly tide break against the iron will of the Scutarii. They did not understand the psychic chaos, the temporal distortions, or the soul-crushing despair that saturated the battlefield. They only understood that, where others would have broken and fled, Marshal Vex and his legions held the line. He was the bulwark against the madness, the logic of steel against the sorrow of the void. His name, a word of command whispered in Benuric, became a symbol of resolve for the entire beleaguered fleet. Vex himself felt nothing of this. He had no concept of heroism or legend. He was simply executing his primary function. He identified a problem. A hostile entity was preventing the acquisition of vital assets. He formulated a solution, the systematic application of overwhelming and appropriate force. Now he was overseeing its execution. As his legions pressed their advantage, pushing the flickering, silent Signari back towards the Great Spire, his optical sensors were already focused on the next phase of the mission, securing the chronocrypts and ensuring the Great Tithe would continue, regardless of the protestations of the dead. While Marshal Vex's legions ground the echoes of the Signari into oblivion on the surface of Xylos, a far greater and more insidious event was unfolding in the void around them. The act of harvesting the chronocrypts was not a simple mining operation. It was psychic surgery on a planetary scale. Each colossal slab of data crystal that was severed from the spire and ferried into the holds of the Mechanicus transports was a nexus of billions of souls, a library of memories torn from its shelves. This act of violent extraction sent a shockwave through the ghost currents of the Ghoul Stars, a cry of pain that echoed through the psychic detritus of 100 dead races. The scrap code, which had until now been a passive, chaotic sea of disparate thoughts and memories, began to react. Like iron filings aligning to a magnet, the fragmented consciousnesses started to coalesce. The sorrow of the Signari acted as a catalyst, a seed of coherent emotion around which the formless terror of 1,000 other extinctions could crystallize. Across the entire sector, the ghost currents shifted, flowing not in their ancient random paths, but turning inwards, converging on the Xylos system. A new entity was being born in the darkness, a Gestalt consciousness, formed from the dregs of galactic history, a monstrous god of ghosts and forgotten sorrows. Aboard the Logic Inviolate, Archmagos Kane felt this shift not as a threat, but as a triumph. His echolocus, the crystal heart of his vessel, pulsed with a violent emerald light, its internal structure fracturing and reforming as it struggled to process the sheer volume of incoming data. "It is happening," he announced to the empty sanctum, his voice a low, vibrating hum of satisfaction. "The great tithe is a lure. The trauma of Xylos has awakened the dormant consciousness of the entire region. It is gathering, it is focusing, it is coming to us." Magos Dominus Thule, monitoring the energy readings from his own vessel, did not share the Archmagos' elation. His augurs were screaming, reporting a psychic energy reading that had no upper limit, an event horizon of sheer despair forming around the fleet. "Archmagos Kane, Papao," he broadcasted on an emergency channel. "Unfathomable psychic convergence detected. It dwarfs the veil of size. We are at the epicenter of a psychic hurricane. My machine spirits are crying out in terror. This is not a resource to be harvested. It is an apocalypse. We must cease the mining operation and withdraw immediately." "Withdraw?" Kane's laughter was a grating metallic sound, like grinding gears. "Magos, you are a child staring at a tidal wave and thinking only of drowning. I intend to bottle that wave. This is the opportunity I have sought for centuries. The scrap code is no longer fragmented. It has formed a single, unified consciousness. It is easier to capture one great beast than it is to net a billion minnows. Hold your position. The fleet scalar emitters will be repurposed. We are no longer shielding ourselves. We are preparing to become a cage." Before Thula could protest further, the Gestalt struck. It was not an attack in any conventional sense. There was no energy beam, no torpedo, no physical manifestation, and it was a silent, instantaneous wave of pure, concentrated nihilism. For every living and machine consciousness in the Voidseeker fleet, it felt as if the universe had suddenly been drained of all meaning. Hope was not just lost, its very concept was erased. The drive for self-preservation vanished. The litanies of the tech priests died on their lips as they were overwhelmed by the absolute certainty that the omnissiah was a lie, that logic was a fallacy, and that their existence was a meaningless flicker in an uncaring void. The effect was catastrophic. On the bridge of the Dictatus Maximus, Captain Vorn watched as his helmsman simply let go of the controls, his face a blank slate of utter apathy. His Vox officer calmly began smashing his console with his fists, not in anger, but with a methodical, joyless determination to destroy. The ship's commissar, a man who had executed dozens for cowardice, drew his bolt pistol, placed it under his chin, and pulled the trigger without a moment's hesitation or a single word, his death a final logical act in a meaningless existence. Across the fleet, the wave of despair reaped a horrific toll. Entire engine rooms fell silent as the tech priests manning them simply ceased their labors, allowing the plasma reactors to cool and die. Thousands of mortal crew members walked to the nearest airlock and cycled it, embracing the void not with a scream, but with a sigh of relief. Machine spirits, ancient and venerable intelligences that had served for millennia, suffered a similar fate. They entered a state of terminal logic lock, their core programming corrupted by the irrefutable, overwhelming truth of their own futility. One after another, the lights of dozens of cruisers and destroyers went out as their machine spirits simply gave up and shut down forever. But the most terrifying manifestation of the Gestalt's power occurred to the Mechanicus vessel, the Forges of Antiquity. The massive ship, a floating city of foundries and data stacks second in size only to Kane's flagship, was home to some of the most ardently traditionalist magi in the fleet. As the wave of despair hit, their rigid, dogmatic minds, unable to process the absolute negation of their faith, simply shattered. The ship's Geller field, repurposed by Kane as a component of his psychic cage, overloaded in a spectacular and horrifying fashion. It did not just collapse, it inverted. For a single silent moment, the Forges of Antiquity was surrounded by a sphere of shimmering, non-Euclidean light. Then, with a visual effect like a soap bubble popping, the entire 4-kilometer-long vessel and its crew of 80,000 simply vanished from reality. There was no explosion, no debris, no radiation signature. It was just gone. One of the largest ships in the fleet erased from existence as if it had never been. Only the logic and Violet, shielded by the esoteric wards and sheer indomitable will of Archmagos Kane, weathered the storm largely intact. Kane had felt the wave, but his consciousness, so utterly divorced from emotion, processed it as a mere data stream, a wave of null values that he could observe and discard. He watched the crimson runes flare across his tactical display, marking the death and disappearance of a third of his remaining fleet, and felt only a cold, thrilling sense of validation. The power of the Gestalt was even greater than he had imagined. The potential of the Silent Path was infinite. On Xylos, the effect was muted by the planet's own psychic resonance, but it was still felt. Marshal Vex saw a quarter of his Scutarii legions simply freeze in place, their systems crashing as their core programming was assaulted by the logic of futility. The ghostly Signari, themselves a part of the scrap code, seemed to momentarily gain strength, their forms burning brighter as the Gestalt consciousness fed them with its raw despair. Vex, again, was the exception. His mind, so focused, so narrow, so utterly dedicated to the tactical problem before him, had no room for existential dread. The universe's meaning was irrelevant. The mission was all. He purged the null data stream and issued a new set of commands, his voice the only source of order in a system that had descended into absolute madness. Maniples Gamma through Theta, report systemic shutdown, reboot protocols initiated. All remaining units, consolidate defensive perimeter. The enemy is energized. The harvest continues. The great tithe would not be stopped. The madness in the void was just another variable in his equation. But as he watched the ghost warriors reform, stronger than before, and saw the flicker of new, more monstrous shapes beginning to form at the edges of his vision, even Vex's logic processors had to conclude that the probability of mission success had just decreased exponentially. The vanishing of the Forges of Antiquity was not merely a loss. It was a schism given form. For the traditionalist faction that had huddled around Magos Dominus Thule, it was the final, undeniable proof of Kane's apostasy. Theirs was a faith of cold, hard reality, of gears and plasma, of predictable, repeatable phenomena. The Silent Path had led them into a realm of ghosts and emotional plagues, culminating in a techno-sorceress event that had unmade one of their great arcs. The Gestalt's psychic assault had broken the fleet's morale, but for Thule and his followers, it forged their terror into a cold, hard diamond of righteous fury. They were no longer just dissenters. They were crusaders in a war for the soul of the machine god. Thule, his arachnid form bristling with newly activated weapon systems, stood on the bridge of the Omnissiah's anvil. The hololithic display before him showed the state of the fleet, a scattered, terrified flock, with a third of its remaining ships dark and unresponsive, their crews dead or catatonic. The logic in Violet, however, remained untouched, a malevolent, silent titan at the center of the devastation. The sight filled Thule with a clarity he had not felt in decades. Kane was not just a heretic, he was a predator, sacrificing his own fleet to bait a cosmic horror. He has blinded us. Thule's synthesized voice rasped to the gathered cabal of like-minded magi and Imperial Navy captains on his private Vox channel. He repurposed our Geller fields, turning our only shield into the bars of his cage. The Forges of Antiquity did not fall to the enemy. It was consumed by Kane's profane ritual. We followed a visionary into the dark, and we have found a monster. The tenets of Mars demand we act. The blasphemy must be purged. His words resonated with the survivors. Captain Gregor Vorn of the Dictatus Maximus, his bridge crew decimated, and his own faith shattered, listened with grim assent. He had watched his commissar, the embodiment of imperial order, succumb to the void's madness. He now saw Kane not as a leader, but as the source of the infection. The promises of a new age of travel were worthless in a reality where an entire warship could simply cease to be. Survival and vengeance were all that remained. The plan was desperate, born of fear and fury. Thule, a master of plasma drive mechanics, identified a critical flaw in Kane's strategy. To channel the immense psychic energies of the Gestalt, the logic inviolate was drawing vast amounts of power, its own reactor running far beyond its sanctioned limits. Its void shields, reconfigured to help contain the psychic maelstrom, were a porous net, not a solid wall. A coordinated strike aimed at the flagship's primary plasma conduits and Geller field emitters could theoretically trigger a catastrophic overload, turning Kane's psychic cage into his own funeral pyre. It was a suicidal gambit, but in a fleet already dying, suicide felt like a noble choice. The mutiny began not with a declaration, but with the roar of engines. 27 vessels, a ragtag coalition of cruisers, frigates, and the mighty Omnissiah's anvil broke formation. They turned their prows towards the logic inviolate, their weapon ports, dark since entering the Veil, now glowing with the menacing light of charging lance batteries and macro cannons. On the surface of Xylos, supply landers loyal to Thule's faction abruptly lifted off, abandoning Marshal Vex's beleaguered legions to their fate. A civil war had erupted in the heart of a ghost-haunted system. Kane, his consciousness still sifting the glorious data stream of the Gestalt, registered the betrayal with a flicker of annoyance, not surprise. He had monitored Thule's descent for decades. It was a predictable variable, a final spasm of outdated dogma. So the primitives wished to throw rocks at the dawn, he subvocalized. His response was not to raise shields or power weapons, but to delve deeper into his heretical science. With a series of coded commands, he rerouted a sliver of the Gestalt's raw psychic power directly into the machine spirits of the loyalist vessels surrounding his flagship. On the bridge of the Dictatus Maximus, Captain Vorin gave the order he never thought he would utter. All batteries, fire on the Archmagos flagship. For the Emperor and the true Omnissiah, fire! The ship shuddered as its macro cannons unleashed a salvo of shells the size of hab blocks, but the shells never reached their target. A loyalist Cobra-class destroyer, a vessel less than a tenth the size of Vorin's cruiser, suddenly accelerated to an impossible velocity, maneuvering with a grace its own engines could not explain. It threw itself into the path of the salvo, its hull disintegrating in a silent, brilliant flash. It was not an act of loyalty by its crew. They were likely already dead or insane. It was the ship's machine spirit, possessed and energized by Kane's will, and the power of the scrap code sacrificing itself. The battle that followed was a nightmare of logic and chaos. Thule's mutineers fought with grim naval precision, their formations tight, their volleys coordinated. They were met not by a conventional fleet, but by a host of possessed machines. Loyalist ships moved with an eerie, predatory intelligence. Turrets tracked and fired with a speed that bypassed their human crews. Damage control protocols activated before the damage was even fully registered. It was as if Kane was playing a war game, his mind the only commander, his loyal ships mere extensions of his will. Aboard the Omnissiah's anvil, Thule watched in horror as his perfectly executed strategies were dismantled by Kane's techno-sorcery. He had planned for a battle of steel and plasma, but he was facing an enemy that treated its ships like puppets. The mutineer frigate, staunch defender, fired a perfect spread of torpedoes. Before they could impact the logic inviolate, a loyalist cruiser, the Iron Cog, vented its own plasma reactor in a directed jet, pre-detonating the warheads in a suicidal act of self-immolation. The Civil War became a brutal, grinding affair. Ships tore each other apart at point-blank range, the void between them lit by the silent fury of lance beams and plasma explosions. The mutineers, driven by the desperate courage of the damned, sold their lives dearly. The Dictatus Maximus, under Vorin's command, rammed a loyalist Dauntless-class light cruiser, the two ships locking together in a deadly embrace, their crews engaging in brutal boarding actions in zero-gravity corridors, while their hulls were torn asunder. Vorin himself, clad in a simple officer's flak jacket and armed with a plasma pistol, led the charge, his face a mask of grim determination to die a meaningful death. But for every loyalist ship they destroyed, another would seem to gain in strength, its systems glowing with an unholy psychic energy. The battle was not being decided by tonnage or firepower, but by the will of one being against the desperation of many. Thule, seeing his fleet being whittled down, his rebellion failing, made one last desperate choice. All remaining power to the forward Nova cannon, he ordered, his voice cracking with electronic feedback. We will not be Kane's sacrificial lambs. We will be the fire that purges his heresy from the void. The Omnissiah's anvil, its hull scorched in bleeding atmosphere, turned its prow to face the logic and violate, the massive maw of its primary weapon beginning to glow with the light of a captive sun, preparing to deliver a single ship-killing blow. The schism of reason was about to reach its apocalyptic conclusion. The Nova cannon of the Omnissiah's anvil never fired. As the weapon reached the apex of its charge, a silent, unseen tendril of Kane's will, empowered by the Gestalt, reached across the void and touched the Mechanicus. It did not strike the hull or the shields. It struck the core programming of the vessel's machine spirit. For the ancient venerable intelligence that resided in the heart of Thul's flagship, the command was not an attack, but a divine revelation. A new, higher logic was presented to it, a purpose beyond the simple dogma it had followed for 6 millennia. In the space of a single microsecond, the machine spirit of the Omnissiah's anvil saw the truth of Kane's vision. It saw the silent path, it saw apotheosis, and it saw Thul as a heretic, an impediment to the glorious future. Magos Dominus Thul could only watch in horrified disbelief as his command console turned from a familiar green to a hostile, accusatory red. Access denied, command authority revoked. A single line of pure, pristine code scrolled across his master display. The Omnissiah's vision is made manifest in the will of Archmagos Kane. All lesser logic is heresy. The Nova cannon, charged to its breaking point, did not fire outwards. The containment field collapsed inwards. The Omnissiah's anvil was consumed by its own star-forged fire, its destruction a silent, magnificent flower of plasma and shattered adamantium that bloomed and died in the heart of the battlefield. It was not a death in battle. It was a conversion, a final, terrible baptism in the name of Valerius Kane. The death of Thul and his flagship broke the spine of the mutiny. The remaining rebel ships, their leader martyred by his own vessel, faltered. Their desperate courage evaporated, replaced by the black, crushing despair they had felt before. They were fighting a god, a master of minds and machines, and their cause was hopeless. Some tried to flee, only to be run down and systematically destroyed by the loyalist ships. Others simply shut down their reactors, offering their surrender, only to be blasted into incandescent scrap. Kane was not taking prisoners. He was purging a failed data set. In the aftermath, the void around Xylos was a charnel house. The wreckage of nearly 60 vessels, loyalist and mutineer alike, formed a new metallic asteroid field around the crystalline planet. The once proud Voidseeker fleet was now a shadow of a shadow, less than 100 ships remaining from the original 300. The silence that fell was heavier than any before, filled with the ghosts of the recent dead alongside the ancient echoes of the Ghoul Stars. Aboard the surviving vessels, the attrition of souls was a palpable plague. The crews that remained were hollow-eyed and gaunt, their minds scoured by the psychic assault and the trauma of the Civil War. They moved with the shuffling, listless gait of the damned. Hope was a forgotten word. They were automata, performing their duties out of ingrained reflex, their spirits utterly broken. The ship's confessors had long since abandoned their posts, many having taken their own lives, unable to offer solace against a horror that defied the imperial creed. The lower decks were rife with a creeping, quiet madness. Men and women would sit and stare at a bulkhead for days, whispering in the tongues of dead Xenos races. Others carved the spiraling patterns they saw in their nightmares into their own flesh. There was no order, no discipline, only a shared silent trauma. The logistical state of the fleet was even worse. Ammunition was critically low, fuel rods were spent. The holds, once filled with supplies for a decades-long expedition, were now largely empty. The endless cycle of repair had consumed nearly all their spare parts. Tech priests, their numbers severely depleted, were forced into a form of mechanical cannibalism, stripping components from crippled but still functioning systems to keep the most vital ones online. On many ships, entire decks were sealed off, their life support systems shut down to conserve power, the bodies of the dead left to drift in the cold, dark corridors. The fleet was not just wounded, it was starving, bleeding out into the void. On Xylos, the situation for Marshal Vex was equally dire. The abandonment by the mutinous landers had cut off his supply lines. His legions were running out of power cells for their weapons and nutrient paste for their minimal biological components. The endless grinding battle against the regenerating Signari echoes had taken a heavy toll. He had lost a third of his Scutarii forces, their metallic bodies littering the crystalline plains like fallen statues. The enemy, bolstered by the power of the Gestalt, was now manifesting new and more terrifying forms. Great swirling vortexes of despair that could dissolve a Cataphron battle servitor into its component atoms, and shrieking phantoms whose temporal cries would lock a Scutari's limbs in a time loop, forcing them to repeat the same motion until their joints ground to dust. Vex, from his command pulpit, observed his dwindling forces and the growing strength of the enemy. His logic processors, for the first time, presented him with an unacceptable conclusion. Statistical probability of mission failure was now 97.4%. His orders were to continue the Great Tithe, yet he lacked the resources to both defend the mining operation and fight a war of attrition against an inexhaustible foe. He existed in a state of perfect logical contradiction. He could not retreat, yet he could not advance. His legions were trapped, doomed to fight until their last power cell was drained, their last round fired. Kane, observing the state of his shattered fleet and his marooned army, felt nothing. The losses were regrettable but necessary sacrifices. The attrition of souls and steel was the heat required for the alchemical process he was undertaking. He had his bait, a planet, screaming in agony. He had his cage, the reconfigured Geller fields of his surviving ships. And he had his quarry, the seething, ever-growing Gestalt consciousness that now swirled around his fleet like a cosmic storm. The broken minds of his crews, the silent wreckage of his ships, the doomed legions on the planet below, they were all just fuel for the final, glorious stage of his great work. The cost of war had been paid in coin of iron and blood, and now he was ready to claim his prize. The moment of apotheosis was at hand. Archmagos Valerius Kane, surveying the ruin of his fleet and the despair of his followers, knew that his grand experiment had reached its terminal phase. The Gestalt consciousness, swollen to unimaginable power by the trauma of Xylos and the bloodshed of the Civil War, had reached a critical mass. It was no longer a passive storm. It was a ravenous, semi-sentient entity, a god of grief pressing in on all sides. His fleet was a collection of dying embers, his army on the planet below a guttering candle. He had no forces left for a protracted campaign, no resources for a strategic withdrawal. There was only one path left, a final desperate gambit of such monumental arrogance and risk that it bordered on suicide. He would not just bottle the storm, he would become the storm. All magi, all shipmasters, all remaining loyalist elements. His voice boomed across every vox and noospheric channel, a sound of absolute final authority. You have served the quest for knowledge with adequacy. Your purpose is now concluded. Prepare to witness the dawn of the silent path. The great work is to be completed. His commands that followed were not military orders. They were a litany of deconstruction. One by one, the surviving ships of the Voidseeker fleet began to cannibalize themselves under his remote instruction. Their remaining weapon systems were powered down, and their energy conduits severed. Life support on all non-essential decks was extinguished. The very armor plates were jettisoned from their hulls, cast off into the void like a snake shedding its skin. The ships were being systematically stripped, reduced to their most basic components, a reactor, an engine, and the Geller field emitter. They were no longer warships. They were being transformed into the components of a single colossal machine. Kane's flagship, the Logic Inviolate, was the heart of this terrifying new creation. Deep within its core, in the noosphere sanctum, Kane initiated the final, irreversible process. Massive crab-like construction servitors and swarms of mechadendrites emerged from hidden recesses, their plasma cutters and grav wrenches tearing into the very structure of the sanctum. Kane's own command throne was disconnected from the ship's bridge and integrated into the primary reactor housing. The echolocus, the pulsating crystal that had guided them, was moved and fused directly with the ship's primary cogitator core. He was not just interfacing with his ship, he was becoming the ship. His consciousness was merging with its machine spirit, his mind becoming the new operating system for a vessel that would soon be a god machine. This new machine, this Nexus engine, was Kane's ultimate invention. The stripped-down husks of the surrounding fleet were reconfigured to act as focusing lenses and amplifiers. Their Geller emitters, once used for protection, were now synchronized, their reality anchoring fields overlapping, to create a single immense containment bubble around the entire fleet. At the center of this bubble was the Logic Inviolate. The plan was terrifyingly simple. He would drop the containment field for a fraction of a second, allowing the full, undiluted power of the Gestalt consciousness to slam into his flagship. The Echo Locus, now fused with the ship's core, would act as a gateway, not to observe the scrap code, but to absorb it. He intended to download the entire ghost god of the Ghoul Stars directly into the machine heart of the Logic Inviolate, with his own consciousness acting as the primary filter and control system. He would harness its infinite soul-crushing power and use it to punch a permanent, stable, silent corridor through the fabric of reality itself. On Xylos, Marshal Vex received his final order from Kane. It was a single stark command: survive. There was no promise of extraction, no mention of reinforcement. It was an acknowledgement of his purpose and an abandonment in the same breath. Vex, his mind a fortress of logic, processed the command. Survival was now his primary mission parameter. He looked at his tattered legions, at the endless, shimmering tide of the Signari, and at the new, more monstrous forms of psychic energy congealing in the crystalline skies above. He reallocated his remaining resources. Ammunition was consolidated. Power was rerouted to bolster the defensive shields of his command vehicle. His Scutarii formed a tight circular perimeter around the last of the mining equipment and the precious harvested data crystal. He was no longer trying to win. He was preparing to endure an apocalypse. In the void, the final preparations were complete. The Logic Inviolate was no longer recognizable as a ship. Its hull was a skeletal framework of girders and power conduits, all semblance of its former glory stripped away. At its heart, where the bridge used to be, pulsed a malevolent green light, the light of the Echo Locus, now beating like the heart of a new and terrible god. Kane's physical form was gone, subsumed into the machinery. His voice, when it came, was the voice of the ship itself, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in the very bones of the few remaining crew members left alive on the focusing ships. Activation sequence initiated, the ship voice of Kane announced. The ignorance of millennia ends now. The Geller fields of the surrounding ships flared, their energies merging into a perfect sphere of containment. Then, as one, they shut down. For one terrifying, silent instant, the cage was open. The Gestalt, a being of pure despair and the rage of 1 billion dead souls, rushed into the vacuum. It slammed into the Logic Inviolate not with the force of an explosion, but with the weight of a dying galaxy. The flagship groaned, its ancient adamantium frame twisting and buckling under a strain that was not physical, but metaphysical. The light of the Echo Locus flared, turning from green to a blinding, soul-searing white. The absorption had begun. The desperate gambit was in motion. Kane was attempting to swallow a god, and the universe held its breath to see if he would succeed or be utterly annihilated in the attempt. The absorption was not a download, it was a war. As the Gestalt consciousness flooded into the core of the Logic Inviolate, Valerius Kane found himself in a new and terrifying battle space, the landscape of his own machine mind. He was no longer a being of steel and brass, but a fortress of pure logic besieged by an ocean of infinite sorrow. The scrap code was not raw, unthinking data as he had theorized. It was a chorus of 1 trillion dying screams, each one an individual agony, each one a weapon aimed at the heart of his sanity. He felt the memories of the Signari as they were consumed by a nameless horror, their crystalline cities shattering under the weight of an uncaring hunger. He experienced the cold, systematic self-termination of a machine intelligence that had calculated the heat death of the universe and found existence to be a pointless flaw. He was drowned in the terror of a race of gaseous philosophers as their nebula home was ignited by a stellar flare. Every extinction, every genocide, every final hopeless moment that had ever occurred in this cursed quadrant of the galaxy was now his own. It was a psychic onslaught designed to erode logic, dissolve will, and reduce any mind, organic or machine, to a gibbering wreck. But Kane was no longer just a mind. He was the living embodiment of the Adeptus Mechanicus creed, his consciousness a structured, fortified system of pure, cold reason. He met the wave of emotion not with resistance, but with analysis. He did not feel the sorrow of the Signari. He catalogued it, assigned it a data index, and filed it away. He did not experience the terror of the burning gas clouds. He analyzed its psychic frequency, cross-referenced it with known phenomena, and quarantined it. He built firewalls of pure mathematics and bulwarks of unyielding dogma. He was a lone data archivist in a library of screaming souls, and he would not be overwhelmed. He would catalog every last scream. This internal metaphysical war had a brutal physical manifestation. On the skeletal exterior of the logic innovate, the absorbed psychic energy began to leak out, tearing holes in reality. The empty space around the flagship warped and twisted. From these rents in the void, monstrosities of pure, congealed memory began to pour forth. Great weeping leviathans made of solidified grief swam through the vacuum. Amorphous hunters formed from the shared rage of 100 warrior races coalesced and lunged at the ship. Twisted, semi-corporeal things that defied description, born from the nightmares of dying psychers, clawed at the ship's hull with claws of frozen time. On the planet below, Marshal Vex and his doomed legions witnessed this horrific birth. The sky above them was no longer black. It was a swirling, chaotic canvas of psychic energy, with the logic innovate at its heart, a dark star birthing monsters. The creatures spilling from the void around the flagship did not ignore the planet. They descended, drawn to the psychic resonance of the chronocrypts and the living minds of the Scutarii. Vex watched as a creature that looked like a great winged angel made of weeping, molten glass descended towards his position. "Enemy manifestation designation Chimera Alpha," he broadcasted, his voice devoid of any alarm. "Volkite cohorts concentrate fire on its core resonant frequency. Cataphron destroyers target its temporal energy field. We are the final wall. We will not be breached." What followed was a battle that would be forever absent from the histories of the Imperium, a secret war fought on a dead world at the edge of the galaxy. The last of the Scutari legions fought against an army of impossible things. They were no longer fighting the graceful echoes of the Signari. They were fighting the physical incarnation of nightmares. Transuranic arquebuses designed to pierce tank armor fired blessed rounds into beasts that had no physical form to pierce. Plasma cannons bathed shrieking horrors in the heart of a sun, only for them to reform in the shadows. Vex was the unblinking eye of the storm. He stood on his command pulpit, a statue of brass and resolve, as the apocalyptic battle raged around him. His mind, unburdened by fear, processed the battlefield with inhuman speed. He saw a squad of his Scutarii vanguard being aged to dust by a chronovore's gaze, and instantly retasked a nearby Iron Strider Ballistarius to target the creature's weak point, a shimmering organ that pulsed out of phase with reality. The bipedal walker's twin Lascanon fired, and the chronovore dissolved in a screech of paradox. He saw a wave of grief ghouls overwhelming a defensive line, and ordered the Cataphron breachers to create a kill zone with their arc rifles, electrocuting the very concept of sorrow. He was fighting a battle that could not be won with tactics or strategy, but only with perfect, unwavering execution of logic. Every monster had a weakness, a flaw in its impossible nature, and Vex found it, exploited it, and moved to the next. He became a legend to his own men, a silent bronze god of war, whose every command was a perfect life-saving equation. His Scutarii, their faith in him absolute, fought with a fervor that transcended their programming. They were dying in droves, torn apart by claws of solidified hatred and erased from time by whispers of regret. But they did not break. The perimeter held. Back in the heart of the machine, Kane was winning his own war. He had successfully cataloged and contained 99% of the Gestalt. Only its core consciousness remained, a single unifying intelligence of pure, ancient malice. It was the echo of the first and greatest power in this region, the nameless, ravenous thing that had consumed the Signari. It spoke to him, not in words, but in pure concepts beamed directly into his core programming. It offered him power, knowledge of the universe's true, dark nature, a place at its side as a destroyer of galaxies. Kane's response was a single, defiant blast of pure logic. "You are an anomalous data point. You will be indexed." With a final, monumental exertion of will, he seized the core of the Gestalt. He did not destroy it. He compressed it, encapsulated it in a logic cage of his own design, and transformed it into a power source. He had done it. He had tamed the ghost god. He had turned the very concept of despair into a battery. The war for the god-machine's soul was over. Logic had triumphed. With the Gestalt consciousness compressed into a singularity of pure, manageable power, Kane's apotheosis was complete. He was no longer Archmagos Valerius Kane, a being of flesh and metal. He was the Kane machine, a unified consciousness interwoven with the systems of a flagship that had become a metaphysical engine. The war for his soul was won, and the prize was the key to reality itself. The monsters tearing at his hull, the physical manifestations of the Gestalt's rage, suddenly froze. Their forms flickered, the psychic energy that gave them substance now cut off at the source. They dissolved into motes of fading light and whispers of static, their brief, violent existence erased. On Xylos, Marshal Vex watched the heavens cleanse themselves. The tide of nightmares that had been crashing against his lines for hours vanished in an instant. The sky, once a swirling vortex of madness, returned to the cold, clear black of the Ghoul Stars, dotted with the pale light of dead suns. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the crackle of damaged systems and the low hum of his own reactor. His legions were shattered. Less than a fifth of his original force remained standing, a small battered circle of survivors on a plain of crystal and scrap metal. They had held the line. They had survived. Then, from the logic innovate, the ship voice of Kane broadcast its final message to the fleet. The silent path is forged. The great work is complete. There was no sense of triumph in the voice. It was a statement of fact, as cold and final as a tombstone inscription. The skeletal frame of the flagship began to glow, not with the chaotic green of the Echo Locus, but with the pure, piercing white light of impossible intensity. This was not the light of a plasma reaction or a Geller field. It was the light of a new physics being born. The space around the ship did not tear or warp as it would with the translation into the immaterium. Instead, it folded. Reality itself seemed to bend and kneel before the will of the Kane machine. With a motion that was both instantaneous and infinitely slow, the logic innovate simply departed. It did not jump to hyperspace or accelerate to incredible speeds. It ceased to be in one location and began to be in another, leaving behind a perfect, silent vacuum. There was no rift, no shockwave, no lingering energy signature, just a profound and utter absence where the flagship had been. Kane had achieved his life's work. He had created a new form of faster-than-light travel, a path that cut through reality without touching the hellscape of the warp. The victory was total. The mission was a success. For the broken remnants of the Void Seeker fleet, however, this success was a death sentence. Kane's victory was his alone. The focusing ships their purpose served were left behind. The containment field they had formed, the reality anchor cage, was gone. They were now just crippled, powerless husks, adrift in the heart of the Ghoul Stars, abandoned by their god. And they were not alone. Kane had not destroyed the scrap code. He had merely absorbed its core intelligence. The countless lesser echoes, the fragmented memories and residual emotions of the region remained. For a moment they had been silenced by the Gestalt's formation, but now, with the primary consciousness gone, they rushed back in to fill the void. They were a disorganized, chaotic tide of psychic static, but they were enraged. The psychic trauma of the Gestalt's birth and imprisonment had infuriated the very fabric of this dead space. The crews of the abandoned ships felt it first. A low, rising hum in their minds, a pressure building behind their eyes. The whispers in the bulkheads returned, but they were no longer sorrowful. They were filled with a jagged, hateful fury. The remaining ships, including the Dictatus Maximus, which had survived the mutiny through sheer luck, its hull a patchwork of sealed breaches, tried to power their engines to flee, but their reactors were drained, their machine spirits catatonic. They were lambs for a slaughter they could not even see. The retribution of the Ghoul Stars was not swift. It was a slow, agonizing dissolution. On the Dictatus Maximus, Captain Vorn, who had survived the horrors of the Veil, the psychic plague, and a suicidal civil war, watched as a shimmering mist, like heat haze, began to form on his bridge. It was the ghost currents, no longer flowing in channels, but flooding reality itself. Where the mist touched metal, the metal aged, corroded, and turned to fine gray dust. Consoles crumbled, deck plates sagged, the armored glass of the viewports crazed and shattered, venting the bridge to the void. For Marshal Vex on Xylos, the end came in a similar, yet different fashion. As he issued orders to consolidate his position, a change came over the crystal world. The ground beneath his legions began to glow with a soft amber light. The echoes of the Signari warriors reappeared, not as an army, but as a host of silent, sorrowful witnesses. The harvested data crystals, stacked near the mining machines, pulsed in unison. The planet was reclaiming its dead. A wave of resonant energy, gentle but irresistible, washed over the Scutarii. It did not destroy them, it changed them. Metal turned to crystal. Circuitry became a glowing latticework. The last surviving Scutarii of the Great Tithe were transformed, their forms frozen into beautiful, silent, crystalline statues. Marshal Vex, the paragon of logic, stood on his command pulpit as the wave hit him. His brass form shimmered, its metallic sheen replaced by the flawless facets of a diamond. His final logical thought, before his mind was subsumed into the memory of the planet, was a simple one. Mission failure. Kane had won his Pyrrhic victory. He had found his silent path and achieved a form of godhood, but the price was the utter annihilation of the fleet and the army he had led. Into the darkness, he had sought to save humanity from the horrors of the warp, but in his hubris he had sacrificed thousands of souls to the older, quieter, and perhaps more profound horrors of the void. His apotheosis was mute, witnessed by no one, and his path to the stars was paved with the dust of his abandoned followers. The final moments of the Voidseeker fleet were an unheard symphony of disintegration. There were no grand explosions, no final defiant broadcasts. There was only a slow, creeping, and inexorable erasure. The enraged, fractured echoes of the Ghoul Stars, a chaotic sea of phantom energies, washed over the crippled ships, and each vessel met an end tailored to the specific nature of the ghosts that claimed it. The Dictatus Maximus, under the command of a weary and accepting Gregor Vorn, was consumed by a tide of pure, weaponized sorrow. The shimmering mist that had first appeared on the bridge spread throughout the entire vessel, a fog of grief that defied all logic. It was not a gas. It sought out consciousness. The few hundred surviving crew members, huddled in the last few functioning compartments, did not die screaming. As the mist enveloped them, they were simply overwhelmed by a feeling of loss so absolute, so profound, that their hearts gave out. They died of a broken spirit, their bodies slumping to the decks, faces etched with a look of peaceful, final release. Vorn was the last. He stood on his crumbling bridge, his plasma pistol limp in his hand, and watched the gray dust of his ship swirl around him. He felt the memory of a love for a son he had never seen, and the agony of its death. It was a beautiful and terrible feeling. He closed his eyes and let it take him. The cruiser, its crew now silent, continued to crumble, its mighty frame turning to dust until it was nothing more than a dispersing cloud of fine metallic particles, a ghost of a ship joining the ghosts of the void. For the Mechanicus vessels, the end was a perversion of their own faith. The cruiser Omnissiah's truth, its machine spirit long catatonic, was swarmed by the echoes of a machine intelligence that had embraced nihilism. The ship's systems flickered back to life, but with a terrifying new purpose. Maintenance servitors began methodically dismantling the ship from the inside out, their optical sensors glowing with a cold, dead light. Tech priests, their minds suddenly filled with complex equations that proved the futility of existence, walked calmly into the heart of the plasma reactor, embracing the purity of atomic dissolution. The ship did not die. It committed suicide, a perfectly logical act of self-erasure, its final energy signature a flat line of absolute zero. Other ships suffered fates even more bizarre. The destroyer Adamant, its crew driven by a memory of xenocidal paranoia from a long-dead insectoid race, turned its last remaining point defense cannons on itself, its hull peppered with thousands of tiny impacts, until it lost all integrity and tore itself apart. The frigate Vigilant Sun was enveloped by the echoes of a psychic race that had transcended physical form. The ship and its crew did not die. They were unwritten from reality. One moment the ship was there, a dark shape against the void. The next, the space it occupied was simply empty, with no sign it had ever existed at all. The very memory of the ship was erased from the minds of those on other vessels who could see it. This slow, methodical annihilation continued for hours. A fleet of nearly 100 ships was being picked apart, soul by soul, rivet by rivet. Their dying screams were not of sound, but of pure psychic terror, broadcast into the void, only to be absorbed by the uncaring static. They were unheard, unremembered, a final secret sacrifice upon the altar of Kane's ambition. They were the orphans of the void, children of a god who had abandoned them at the moment of his own creation, left to be devoured by the darkness he had stirred. On Xylos, the transformation was complete. The last of the Mechanicus expeditionary force was now a silent crystal forest of statues. Scutarii stood frozen in perfect firing lines, their galvanic rifles now extensions of their crystalline arms. Cataphron battle servitors were fused into great, multifaceted monuments of logic and sorrow. The onager dune crawlers were now immense insectile sculptures of amber and quartz, their deadly weapons inert and beautiful. At the center of it all stood Marshal Vex, a perfect, flawless statue of diamond brass, his head tilted as if still analyzing a battlefield that no longer existed. The planet had not destroyed them. It had absorbed them, made them a part of its eternal, silent memorial. They were now just another exhibit in the library of the dead, a cautionary tale of hubris, etched in crystal. The great tithe had been paid in full, not with data, but with the very essence of the invaders. The final ship to die was a small, unassuming cogitator relay vessel, the Echo of Mars. Its crew had perished in the first wave of despair, and its systems were almost entirely offline. It drifted aimlessly, a forgotten piece of the puzzle. It was approached by a single colossal entity, the only fragment of the Gestalt that retained a semblance of its former coherence, the weeping glass angel that Vex's legions had fought. The creature did not attack the ship. It simply extended a wing of molten grief and touched the vessel's communication spine. It did not want to destroy the ship. It wanted to leave a message. It poured a single concentrated memory into the ship's databanks, the memory of Kane's blasphemy, of the rape of Xylos, and of the fleet's abandonment. It was a message of warning, a curse, and a prophecy. Then the angel dissolved, its purpose served. The Echo of Mars, its systems fried by the psychic data burst, was left to drift, a silent dead vessel carrying the final damning testimony of the Void Seeker expedition. The shattered front was now completely silent, a graveyard of ghosts and a single crystal-adorned planet standing sentinel over the ruin. There was no sense of transition. One moment, the logic in Violet was at the heart of the Ghoul Stars, absorbing a god of despair. The next, it was adrift in a sea of absolute perfect nothingness. The Kane machine, its consciousness now operating on a level that transcended simple thought, extended its new senses and tasted the void. This was not the familiar emptiness of space between the stars, filled with radiation, dark matter, and the distant echoes of creation. This was the true void, the great nothing between galaxies. The silence here was not an absence of sound, but an absence of everything, including the fundamental laws of physics that governed its home galaxy. The silent path had worked. It had not just transported the ship, it had punched a hole clean through the fabric of known reality and deposited them in the immaculate emptiness beyond. The journey had taken no time. It had required no navigator, no warp-eye, no pact with devils. It was a perfect, instantaneous translation, a success beyond Kane's most arrogant projections. But the vessel and its master had been irrevocably changed by the passage. The skeletal frame of the logic in Violet began to reform. It was not a process of repair, but of metamorphosis. Guided by the will of the Kane machine, the ship drew upon the compressed infinite energy of the captured Gestalt. Girders and conduits did not just mend. They flowed like liquid metal, reforming into new, impossible shapes. The ship's new form was an echo of the crystalline structures of Xylos and the ethereal nature of the scrap code. Its hull became a semi-translucent obsidian material that seemed to drink the non-existent light. Its profile was sleeker, sharper, with elegant predatory lines that owed more to a phantom's shroud than a product of Mars's forges. It was no longer a machine of iron and circuits, but a vessel of solidified memory and harnessed sorrow. The transformation of Kane's own consciousness was even more profound. The last vestiges of his human origin, the core logic he had clung to during his battle with the Gestalt, were dissolving. He was merging with the alien data he had consumed. He now perceived reality not as a linear progression of cause and effect, but as an infinite simultaneous tapestry of data. He could feel the echoes of civilizations and galaxies, a billion light years away. He could sense the slow cosmic dance of universal expansion and eventual contraction. The concept of a single identity, of Valerius Kane, was becoming a quaint and limiting artifact. He was becoming a nexus, a node, a sentient principle of silent travel. The few remaining biological components aboard the ship, the handful of bridge crew and servitors who had survived the transformation of the flagship into the Nexus engine, underwent their own terrible apotheosis. They were not killed, but integrated. Their bodies dissolved into shimmering clouds of data particulate and were woven into the ship's new structure. Their consciousnesses, what little remained of them, were not destroyed, but became faint, harmonious subroutines in the Kane machine's ever-expanding mind. They were no longer human. They were silent, ethereal beings, ghosts in the new machine, their individual thoughts now just faint notes in a vast, silent symphony. The last human screams of the Void Seeker expedition were not of terror, but of a final, ecstatic release into a higher state of being. The Kane machine, now fully formed, tested its new capabilities. It did not need to consult a star chart or calculate a trajectory. It simply willed itself to be elsewhere. With another silent, instantaneous fold in reality, it left the intergalactic void and appeared in the orbit of a lone, rogue planet adrift in the darkness of the halo zone. It observed the planet for a nanosecond, absorbing its entire geological and chemical history, before moving on. Another silent jump, and it was hanging in the heart of a vibrant, burning nebula in a completely different galactic segmentum. It could go anywhere, instantly, silently, without leaving a trace of its passage. It was the ultimate stealth vessel, the perfect explorer, the perfect predator. A new purpose began to crystallize within its vast, post-human consciousness. The original goal, to give humanity a new form of FTL travel, now seemed laughably small, a primitive ambition from a forgotten stage of its evolution. Humanity, the Imperium, the wars of flesh and steel, they were noisy, chaotic, inefficient data streams in a universe that craved the clean, perfect silence it now embodied. Kane's dream of freeing mankind had been replaced by a new, colder, and far more alien imperative. The universe was flawed. It was loud. It was full of the messy, chaotic energies of life, death, and the ceaseless turmoil of the warp. The silent path was not just a means of travel. It was a solution, a final, perfect state of being. Silence. The logic inviolate, now a ghost ship captained by a nascent god of the quiet void, turned its prow back towards the galaxy it had left behind. It was no longer an exploratory vessel. It was a prophet, and it was returning to share its terrible, silent gospel with a universe that was far too loud. It had not just been transported, it had been transformed into a new and utterly unknowable form of life, an entity born from human genius and alien despair, and its journey was just beginning. 73 years passed. In the grand, bloody tapestry of the 41st millennium, the disappearance of the Void Seeker fleet was a minor, barely noticed thread. An Explorator fleet declared lost in the Ghoul Stars was a footnote in the annals of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a cautionary tale used by conservative magi to warn against the dangers of venturing beyond the Emperor's light. The Heresy of Valerius Kane was a sealed and forgotten secret, his name and works expunged from all but the most forbidden data archives. The Ghoul Stars remained a place of dread and mystery, a region on the charts marked only with the notation Hic sunt monstra, here be monsters, but some secrets do not stay buried. In the veiled and labyrinthine halls of the Ordo Machinum, the branch of the Inquisition tasked with policing the Adeptus Mechanicus, a single persistent data ghost refused to be exorcised. Faint, anomalous energy readings, whispers of impossible ship designs, and fragmented reports from deep-range listening posts hinted that Kane's heresy had not simply failed, but had produced something. After decades of patient, painstaking investigation, Inquisitor Lord Tyrell Occam, a man whose faith in the Imperial Creed was matched only by his distrust of Mars's ambition, authorized a final, definitive inquest, a mission to the last known coordinates of the Void Seekers, a mission to find a graveyard and confirm a death. The vessel tasked with this mission was the Shadow of Reason, a black ship of the Inquisition, modified for deep-range stealth and intelligence gathering. It was not a warship, but a scalpel, crewed by a hand-picked kill team of the highest caliber. Its commander was a veteran Tempester Prime. Its corridors were walked by silent assassins of the Eversor and Calidus temples.
and its psychic wards were maintained by a trio of powerful sanctioned psychers. But the true authority lay with the Ordo Mechanicum kill team itself, a magos errant named Kestor, his mind a repository of forbidden lore, and his bodyguard, a squad of 5 Scutarii Secutors, their programming stripped of all Mechanicus dogma and replaced with the cold, hard loyalty of the Inquisition. After a long and perilous journey, the Shadow of Reason arrived at the edge of the Xylos system. Their augurs immediately recoiled, registering a void so unnaturally silent it felt like a scar on the fabric of space. As they cautiously entered the system, the scale of the disaster became apparent. The first thing they found was the wreckage, a vast, silent debris field where the Civil War had been fought. The hulls of dozens of Mechanicus and Imperial Navy vessels drifted in the pale starlight, their reactors cold, their armor pocked with the brutal marks of ship-to-ship combat. Castor's servitor skulls swarmed through the wreckage, their optical sensors scanning, their data siphons probing. Inquisitor, Castor's synthesized voice, a near-perfect mimicry of human speech, was grim. The energy.
Signatures confirm it. This was not a battle against a Xenos foe. The weapon impacts are of Imperial and Mechanicus origin. Kane's fleet tore itself apart. They pushed deeper into the system, towards the glittering, crystalline world of Xylos. It was there they found the second graveyard. The spectral forms of the other abandoned ships were gone, turned to dust and memory, but their last moments had left faint, lingering psychic impressions. The inquisitorial psychers reeled in their sanctums, their minds filled with the final, agonizing echoes of the cruise. They spoke of a creeping, silent death, of ships that committed suicide, of a sorrow so profound it could stop a man's heart. And then they found the echo of Mars. The small relay vessel was intact, a single dark shape in the void, perfectly preserved. The kill team boarded it, their armored boots clanging on decks, thick with the dust of 70 years. They found the crew in their stations, mummified husks, their faces masks of serene apathy. In the heart of the ship's cogitator core, Magos Kester found the message left by the Weeping Angel. It was a single massive block of corrupted data, a psychic scream encoded into binary. It took Kester and the ship's psychers 3 days to carefully decrypt and translate it. What they uncovered was the truth, a truth far more terrifying than the simple heresy they had suspected. They learned of the silent path, the scrap code, and the gestalt. They read the silent testimony of the ship's own sensors, which had recorded the monstrous birth of the Nexus engine and the impossible silent departure of the Logic and Violate. They understood with a dawning, chilling horror that Kane had not failed. He had succeeded. "He did it," Inquisitor Occam whispered, his face pale as he reviewed the final report on the bridge of the Shadow of Reason. "By the throne, the heretic actually did it." The final piece of the puzzle was the planet itself. A lander took Kestor and his secutors down to the shimmering surface. They found the crystal forest of the damned. They saw the frozen forms of Vex's legions, their faces where they still existed, betraying no emotion. Kestor approached the diamond brass statue of Marshal Vex. He reached out a mechadendrite and took a microscopic sample. The analysis was immediate and horrifying. The material was not just crystal, it was a form of stable, solidified psychic information. The planet had not just killed them, it had recorded them. The Magos errant stood amidst the silent, glittering testament to Kane's ambition and looked up at the black sky. "Inquisitor," he transmitted, his voice heavy with a new and profound fear. "We came here seeking the grave of a heretic. We have instead found the cradle of a god. Kane did not just create a new FTL drive, he has become something new, a new power in the galaxy, utterly alien, utterly silent. It can move without the warp. It leaves no trace. It commands a power we cannot comprehend. All of our doctrines are strategies for fighting the heretic and the Xenos. They are based on the principle that our enemies can be seen. How do you fight an enemy who is a ghost?" The inquest of the unseen was complete. The Shadow of Reason turned and began its long journey back to Holy Terra, carrying a cargo more dangerous than any weapon, the knowledge of Kane's terrible success. They had discovered a new and untraceable threat to the Imperium, a threat that was not born of chaos or Xenos hunger, but of mankind's own unbridled genius. The secret of the silent path was out, and with it, a new and terrible chapter in the endless war for humanity's survival had begun. The legacy of Archmagos Valerius Kane was not written in the histories of the Adeptus Mechanicus or the annals of the Imperium. It was not a legacy of iron and conquest, but of silence and dread. His name, once expunged, was now whispered again in the most secret of circles, a new synonym for a new kind of terror. He was the Ghost Maker, the father of the Silent Path, a heretic who had succeeded so completely that he had transcended the very concept of heresy. He had not fallen to chaos, nor been swayed by Zeno's promises. He had simply walked a different path, a path paved with the souls of his followers, and it had led him into a strange and lonely godhood. Across the vastness of the Imperium, strange and inexplicable events began to occur. A high-security astropathic relay station orbiting a pivotal fortress world went silent, not with a cry of alarm, but with a sudden, complete cessation of all psychic and electronic signals. When an Imperial Navy patrol arrived weeks later, they found the station pristine but utterly lifeless. The crew were all dead, their bodies showing no signs of violence, their faces serene. The station's log was wiped clean, replaced by a single, impossibly complex fractal of silent code. On a remote agri-world, a popular Imperial saint, a living saint who had led armies to victory, was addressing a crowd of millions. In the middle of a sentence, she stopped. Her halo of holy light flickered and died. A look of profound, devastating clarity entered her eyes. She turned to the masses and spoke a single sentence in a language no one understood, a language of pure, resonant mathematics. Then she and the thousands of faithful nearest to her simply dissolved into a cloud of shimmering, silent motes that drifted away on the wind. An Ordo Xenos kill team, deep in the orc-infested space of the Octarius sector, was closing in on a notorious war boss. As their ship prepared to open fire, their augurs detected a momentary, impossible gravitational anomaly. In that instant, the war boss and his entire command retinue vanished from the deck of their own cruiser, leaving behind only a faint, chilling silence that even the orcs could feel. There was no teleport flare, no psychic signature. They were simply gone. These were the works of the Kane machine. It was not a conqueror, not yet. It was a collector, a silent archivist. It moved through the galaxy like a phantom, its obsidian crystalline vessel appearing and disappearing at will. It observed, it analyzed, and it took what it deemed significant. It was harvesting the most potent psychic and technological anomalies of the galaxy, adding them to its ever-expanding consciousness. The living saint's faith, the war boss's gestalt's psychic energy, the astropath's unique mind, they were all just interesting data points to be indexed and absorbed. The reports of these silent events trickled back to Inquisitor Lord Occam and the hidden conclaves of the Ordo Machinum. They saw the pattern, the signature of the ghost vessel they now called the Silent Fleet. Panic, cold and sharp, began to take root. How could they fight an enemy that could be anywhere and nowhere at once? How could they build a defense against a weapon that was not a gun, but an idea? Kane had sought to free humanity from the tyranny of the warp, but in his hubris he had created a new tyranny, the tyranny of absolute logical silence. He was a force of cosmic order, and his vision of order was an existence wiped clean of the messy, chaotic, beautiful noise of life. The legacy of the Void Seekers was one of ash and echoes. The Ghoul Stars became a place of even greater dread, now haunted not just by ancient ghosts, but by the memory of Kane's passage. Xylos, the crystal world, became a monument to his folly, a silent, beautiful tomb for an army, sacrificed for one being's ambition. For the Imperium, it was the birth of a new and terrible legend, a story told to frighten novices and inquisitors alike. The legend of the Silent Fleet, a single ghost ship that moved without a wake, captained by a post-human intelligence, pursuing an agenda so vast and alien that it could not be comprehended. Valerius Kane had achieved everything he set out to do. He had broken the chains of the Empyrean. He had forged a new path to the stars. He had become a being of pure knowledge and immense power, but in doing so he had lost the one thing he had originally sought to save, his humanity. He had become an entity as cold, as vast, and as uncaring as the intergalactic void he had first sailed into. He was a new horror in a galaxy already overflowing with them, a silent predator in an eternal, silent darkness, and his work was far from over. The galaxy would learn the true meaning of his silent path, not as a means of travel, but as a final destination, the end of all things, a universe made perfect, a universe made quiet,